over to Connor Strickley with Harnessing Critical Thinking to Your Advantage. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So a genuine thank you to everyone coming out. I know there's heaps of stuff to be doing at BSides, and coming to see my talk means a lot. It's probably the least technical talk at the conference, so hopefully I'm giving you a little break. Minds aren't absolutely melted by all the wizards that are around. That being said, I know I'm between everyone and food, so let's get into it. So I couldn't write this without Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia being front and center. That's the face of an analyst trying to understand and correlate what's going on. On that note, if anyone has figured out who Carol or Pepe Sylvia are, let me know. So imagine a world as the digital world as a complex ecosystem where defenders, attackers, and everyone in between are navigating a constantly shifting landscape. To thrive in this environment, you need more than just technical skills. You need the ability to think and adapt. It's like having a mental toolkit that empowers you to analyze situations from multiple perspectives, question assumptions, and make informed decisions under pressure. Whether you're a blue team defending against attacks, a red team simulating threats, or anywhere else in the cyber realm, critical thinking is your key to success. It allows you to anticipate vulnerabilities, uncover hidden patterns, and develop strategies. So if you're ready to gain an advantage in the ever-evolving world of cybersecurity, stick around. I'll go through some concepts which demonstrate how critical thinking can elevate your skills. So who am I? I'm a dad, DIY, a breaker of things, and I can't say no to a good beer or low and slow barbecue. I'd like to point out that although this has a psychological and neuroscience twang to it, I've got no business talking on their behalf. They're way smarter than me. But what do I know? I started my InfoSec career in telecommunications in various roles, including doing tech support for a large ISP. I thought it was a good idea to join the Defence Force in 2015, where signals intelligence was supposed to be cyber. Was not, unfortunately. But I then managed to move into DFI, threat hunting and CTI. Since then I've moved into the private industry, but still have close knits to defence and government. Done a bunch of formal training, but some of them are listed there. Feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn, more than happy to have a chat about anything. Cyber, pretty much. So why this talk? Everybody lies. We lie to ourselves every day without knowing it. Well, I could have written a talk about my current field on DNS and its applicability to the wider threat landscape. I took a step back and I realized a lot of my experience has come to critical thinking. The way I've always approached something is, how do I solve this problem? That comes from an inquisitive mindset, digging deeper into what is asked as a low order question to understand what the real questions are. So critical thinking, problem solving, and informed decision making can be applicable to almost every industry at every level. This goes from candidates I've interviewed for roles up to directors. The common question to understand the needs and have some awareness of the problem is why, which is often followed up by a what if. Perhaps you've got a boss that's a tad excitable. Sorry, Matt. They jump straight to a conclusion without examining all of the evidence. In an effective team, open and transparent communication can really save you. Through some of the techniques I'll talk about, the path to problem solving is reduced by taking a purpose-driven path rather than exploring every avenue. I'm sure everyone has spent plenty of time going down unnecessary rabbit holes to reduce, so let's try to reduce that time. So my take on critical thinking. Critical thinking skills don't come overnight, and in my experience, it's not very well taught. I've spoken about a low order question previously. Schooling and education is full of these sorts of questions. For example, if I were to ask anyone in this room, what is phishing? I'm pretty sure most of you would have a very similar answer. But applying that to something like, how can organizations effectively combat the rising sophistication of phishing attacks, particularly those leveraging social engineering and AI, that would require most people to take a step back and have a think. To highlight how that critical thinking can be applied to most roles, here are a few examples straight out of my life. This is one's kind of more towards the students out there and people that are trying to dive into the industry. So business, 19-year-old me was thrown in the deep end as a restaurant manager at KFC, and I was told to make the restaurant more profitable. I had no experience, I'm a 19-year-old, but understanding the root cause was pivotal to making that work. So how do we make more money out of this delicious, but disgusting, but delicious fried chicken? Sales. I moved into customer retention for a telecommunications provider where the goal was to retain 75% of people who called through to me. Understanding that people wanted to cancel, or why people wanted to cancel, was super important. Sure, a lot of the time it was price, but what happens if I could bundle their whole family internet and energy bills into one? This would save them time, money, and simplify their lives. Same thing goes for a general tech support. Like, so many people would just call up and want to cancel their service because they didn't have enough coverage or something along those lines. Making them understand what the core problem was a key moment to keeping as many people on board as we could. Then I talk about ISP tech support. Condolences to those who have been through this, but every call every day was solving some kind of problem. It's a great learning experience to identify a root cause of a problem based on an initial hypothesis. How do I get this less than tech-savvy 70-year-old to give me the information I need to prove a fault? How can I do this with the least amount of disruption to them and their lives? While some people were happy running through the pre-baked scripts that we would give, I thought a real understanding of the core problem could drive efficiency rather than going through a list of have you turned it off and on again style questions. Then I moved on to intelligence. This is where I had some formal training, and it was an interesting experience. Ways of thinking in defense is very much indoctrinated with the left and right of arc. One day you'd have a few hours to come up to a decision, other times you'd have a few minutes. So how do you make an assessment on multiple sources of intelligence to give an overarching strategic brief on any particular threat? And then moving on into cyber, moving on from the intelligence world into the cyber realm was very similar. Overwhelming amounts of information can be given. How do you know that alert that you just flagged as a false positive wasn't a true positive? Is the assessment you've made about a particular threat actor, or is it another threat actor using the same techniques to masquerade their actions? Or are there multiple threat actors trying to achieve different end goals? So let's get into some theory. Apologies, it's kind of dry, but I promise it will be at least somewhat relevant to some aspect of your life. So cognitive bias is what makes our lives easy day to day. It's about our life experiences and how we form rapid assessments on any particular situation. By making these assessments, we're drawing on past experience in an attempt to predict the future. Unfortunately, in the InfoSec domain, this is an automated process which our brain wants to take that can lead us to making an error in judgment. I personally believe that cognitive bias is one of the biggest hurdles to overcoming critical thinking. Without being aware of our bias, we make assumptions which may lead to errors in our judgment. This is for those working in a similar role to ISPs trying to break into the industry. Honestly, it can be a bit of a drag, but the more you engage yourself, the more you have a solid foot forward. So example straight out of IT, always fun. Let's imagine 80-year-old Henry who calls up the support line. His internet's not working, all of the cables are plugged into his router, and he's been sitting in his chair all morning, so he hasn't tampered with the device at all. There's no lights on the device, and he just wants to play bingos with his friend on the iPad. We want to help Henry as quickly as possible, so we have to come up with a few beliefs based on our assumptions. So we confirm in the background that we can't see any network traffic. Billing is all up to date, the account's active, no lights, leads me to a hardware failure pretty much straight away. So let's just ship him out a new router and be done with it. Wrong. While we have followed the standard operating procedure, we haven't identified the root cause. In this scenario, there was a power outage in the suburb. He didn't know it would affect the internet on his iPad. He just wants to play bingo. Sure, most of us know that no power would mean no internet, but perhaps we've uncovered a lacking question in a fault identification check. And now we can update this SOP. From a career perspective, this is really going to proactively put you above your peers. So let's dig a little bit deeper into cognitive bias. We would be here for hours of days if I listed out every individual bias, but they're broadly aligned into two categories. You've got your unconscious bias. Where am I up to? Yeah, conscious bias, sorry. Conscious bias is the types of bias that we can be made aware of and that can be accessed and easy to change. Unconscious bias, on the other hand, can be difficult to be made aware of, making it much harder to change. I'll give some examples of both shortly. Of course, some mitigations can be put in place. I think one of the easiest ones is just educating yourself on your own blind spots or potential bias, especially when, which is included in your day-to-day role. Did you just get that alert in your scene because Carol typed her password in too many times again, or has the threat actor tried logging in using previous compromised credentials? Did you even look to notice that the IP address that was used was from a less than reputable ASN? What about the following logon from an AWS range rather than Dodo Internet, which is typical for this user? And I spoke before about transparent dialogue. It's another really good one. If people are feeling blamed or berated over their incorrect assessments, they're not going to speak up. As a manager of my team, I try to keep discussions open where it's appropriate, and my team has pointed out flaws in my own thinking multiple times. Regardless of the outcome, remains the same. Having the perspective of someone else can make you say, hey, yeah, fair point, I hadn't thought of it that way. And this leads into seeking diverse perspectives. Each member of your team or any other of your peers will have a different perspective to you. Allowing that transparent dialogue will give them the confidence to speak freely. And lastly, structured decision-making frameworks. It's a tricky one. The concept of a decision-making framework, such as the OODA loop or F3 EAD, can be helpful in many situations, but it's important to remain flexible to allow innovation. In the same way a playbook or a SOP should be dynamic, just because it worked in your last engagement doesn't mean it's going to work in your next one. So confirmation bias, in essence, confirmation bias is our tendency to favour information that confirms our existing beliefs or hypotheses while ignoring or discounting evidence that contradicts them. We all like to be right, and this bias can lead us to selectively interpret information in a way that reinforces our own preconceptions. So how does that apply to cybersecurity? Imagine you're a security analyst investigating a potential breach. You might have a hunch about the source of the attack, and confirmation bias could lead you to focus on evidence that supports your theory while overlooking other possibilities. This could result in delayed or incomplete responses, allowing the attacker to further exploit the system. Similarly, confirmation bias can affect how we evaluate security products or solutions. We might be more likely to trust a vendor whose marketing aligns more with our existing views, even if their product has flaws, or maybe we dismiss a new technology because it challenges our established processes. Again, to combat confirmation bias, we need to cultivate a mindset of open-mindedness and critical thinking. We should actively seek out diverse perspectives, challenge our own assumptions, and be willing to change our minds in the face of new evidence. Remember, in cybersecurity, the stakes are high. We can't afford to let our own biases blind us to the truth. Anchoring bias. In simple terms, anchoring bias is our tendency to rely on the first piece of information that we receive. This initial information acts as an anchor, influencing subsequent judgments even if it's irrelevant or inaccurate. This bias can manifest in various ways. For example, if a security team's initial assessment of a new threat that is low risk, they might be anchored to that perception, even as new evidence suggests that it's a higher level of threat. This can lead to delayed or inadequate responses, leaving systems vulnerable. Similarly, during incident response, an initial estimate of the damage caused by a breach could serve as an anchor, potentially underestimating the true extent of the compromise. And lastly, how many times have you found while doing a pen test that the first open service outside of the norm is definitely the right way in? I mean, that can take hours off of your time trying to get into something. To mitigate this bias, again, it's vital to cultivate critical thinking and challenge those initial assumptions. Every now and then, take a step back and ask yourself why you're trying to do this. What is the end goal? And again, encourage diverse perspectives within your team and actively seek out alternative viewpoints. Remember, the first piece of information isn't always the most accurate. Remaining flexible and open to the new data is crucial for effective defense. So in essence, availability bias is our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or readily available in our memory. It's like judging the frequency of shark attacks based on recent news headlines, even though they're quite rare, especially in Canberra. In this industry, this bias can lead us to focus on threats that have been recently published or experienced, while neglecting other potentially more dangerous risks. For example, a company recently suffered a breach by a publicly exposed web app, become hyper-focused on preventing that in future, while overlooking other vulnerabilities in other areas. Availability bias can influence our perception of solutions. We might be drawn to products that promise protection on high-profile threats, even if they don't address our needs or vulnerabilities. Marketing can be really manipulating. To combat availability bias, we need to cultivate a data-driven approach, regularly review threat intelligence, conduct risk assessments, and prioritize security measures based on objective data, rather than gut feelings or recent headlines. Remember, the most memorable threats aren't always the most likely. Reasoning. So reasoning uses logic and information and evidence to form conclusions or judgments. Two main types of reasoning being inductive reasoning, which is a bottom-up approach. So it starts with specific observations like patterns in log files, and then uses them to form general hypotheses or theories about the potential threat. Pattern recognition, identifying similarities between attacks, allowing us to categorize threats and develop proactive defenses. And then in threat hunting, we're using past attack data and current trends to predict future attack methods and discover new vulnerabilities. Examples, heuristic-based detection uses rules and patterns to identify suspicious behavior, even if it's not a known threat. And then we've got machine learning, which learns from large data sets, identifying anomalous and potential attacks without relying on predefined rules. This is different to deductive reasoning, which is a top-down approach. It starts with a general principle or established knowledge, like a known attack vector or security framework, and applies them to specific situations to identify threats. We're talking more like signature-based detection, matching known attack signatures and to detect and block specific threats. Then vulnerability assessments uses known vulnerabilities to identify weaknesses in a system and prioritize remediation. Examples of these kind of antivirus software firewall rules kind of thing. 5 whys. I've said the word why a lot, so let's dive into the 5 whys analysis. It's an iterative, interrogative technique used to explore the cause and effect relationship of underlying particular problems. The 5 kind of derives its name from an anecdotal observation of the number of iterations needed to resolve the problem or understand the root cause. Though it might be more, it might be less. It really depends how deep you want to go. The primary goal of the technique is to determine that root cause and just continuously asking why. Each question forms the basis of the next question. Yeah, this is pretty small. I thought it would be. So I'll go through this word by word, but a data breach, for example. So why did the data breach occur? The initial answer would be an attacker exploited a vulnerability in our web app. Why was the vulnerability exploitable? It wasn't patched. Why was the vulnerability not patched? The patch was not applied due to a misconfiguration in our patch management system. Why was there a misconfiguration in the patch management system? The IT team responsible for patch management lacked sufficient training on the system. Why did they lack sufficient training? There was no formal training program in place for new technologies. So that's the 5. I mean, you can go down to 6 and go say, hey, why wasn't there a formal training program? Perhaps it's budgetary, or perhaps it's just time limitation. So in summary, we made it. It's nearly lunchtime. The image you're seeing on the screen is my brain a lot of the time. Everyone has bias, so how are you going to identify these and combat them? The way our brains are wired manipulate how we think. Some of this we have control over, others we really need to work on, and seek diverse perspectives often. Building out teams with diverse minds can contribute to these efficiencies. Your tools are going to lie to you. If you don't understand how they work, it's going to be really hard to justify your actions. Continue learning. Don't believe your tools. They're there to supplement your knowledge. They're not supposed to be the base. And human thought and critical thinking is becoming more and more important, especially with rapid development of AI platforms. Asking, is this true, or why is this the right answer, is essential to utilizing these platforms effectively. I've been playing around with these, and 7 times out of 10 they're okay. But remember, you shouldn't be a direct consumer of these platforms. I'd need many hands to count how often they've been wrong. For those applying for roles, if you are using AI, please understand the output. It's super obvious when a hiring manager asks you an operational question and you can't answer it. You're just reciting whatever OpenAI has told you. And that's the end of my talk. Are there any questions at all?
Sorry, just what you were touching on with inductive and deductive reasoning. Of the 2 options, which do you think is more computationally expensive?
Was that computationally expensive?
Yeah, human computation, like thinking-wise.
Yeah. Let's say inductive reasoning, because then you're going to have to consider your bias all the time as well. So if we're going through a bunch of logs, right, your previous experience is always going to kind of point you in the direction of going down that specific path. Whereas deductive reasoning, it is what it is, essentially. Each has false positives though, right? So, yeah.
Any other questions?
That's all right, right now. So in teams, how do you identify the individuals for the
So it was in teams, how do you remediate the cognitive bias? And identify it. I guess it's all about being open, right? If your teams aren't in a safe space, I suppose, they're not going to speak up. My boss over here, he's always been really supportive of just saying what you think. More people learn from it, right? And also, you're not always going to be the smartest person in the room. And you're going to have your own flaws. So someone else pointing that out for you in that safe space is super important.
Just to build on that last question, if you've got someone who's resistant to identifying their own biases and clings to them, how do you resolve that?
That's a really good question. It all comes down to the person. So I guess that's more of a behavioral thing that you're going to have to address. Certain people are going to be super combative when you say, hey, you're wrong, this is the right answer. So it's about beating around the bush and trying to let them understand what the correct answer is rather than pointing it out directly. Again, you can ask them a question back and say, hey, why do you think that's correct? Have you considered it this way? Rather than just saying, you're wrong, this is the correct answer. And again, you learn from it.
Not a question. If you use the De Bono technique of 6 thinking hats, where each person is empowered to be, for, against, there's different coloured hats, black hats, red hats, that sort of thing. That sort of sets up a social setting where people are empowered to be devil's advocate, that sort of thing. So if you want to learn about it, just look it up on the web. Thank you.
Thanks, appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. And as a gift from BSides for making the conference what it is, here you go.
Thank you very much.